This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to mon ami Fabrice for hosting this series of seminars with my institute in London. I think this is the fourth year. An excellent example of entente cordiale. And it's also very nice to be here giving a talk about my work. I think it's 10 years ago since I came to Fabrice's previous university at Nanterre and spoke about monarchy and empire, and this was the beginning of my long journey into this area of study. So it's very nice to be back in the company of you all to talk about it. My work is now focused on one aspect of monarchy and empire, Queen Victoria and India, about which I'm completing a book for Yale University Press. And the book makes two main arguments. The first is that Queen Victoria, as Queen of India, and later as Empress, Queen of India 1858, Empress of India 1877, she is not simply a passive symbol. She is much more than that, both in Britain and in India itself. There is an active engagement by the British royal family in India, in Indian politics and culture, and there is also an active engagement by various people throughout all the regions of India in understanding, imagining, contesting Queen Victoria herself. The second claim that my book makes is that India represents to the British monarchy and to particularly Queen Victoria a realm of constitutional prerogative. This is a part of her rule where she can intervene, where she is not a constrained constitutional monarch, but where she can aspire to personal rule. Now, both of these themes, Queen Victoria's engagement with India and Queen Victoria's idea about constitutional prerogative in India, both of these themes, I think, become clearer if we look at the Indian mutiny or the revolt, Indian revolt of 1857-8, the place of the revolt in Queen Victoria's own politics, and the place of Queen Victoria in the ideas and arguments of the rebels and mutineers. And that's what I want to do this afternoon. So, news of the revolt in India reached London in July 1857, just as Queen Victoria was meeting with members of the royal family of Awadi, of Oud. And of course it was the royal family whose court at Lucknow lay at the centre of the uprising against British rule in 1857-8. It was a coincidence, Queen Victoria meeting the royal family, which was not noticed at the time and hasn't really been noticed since. Malaika Kishwar, the mother of the deposed king of Awadi, along with a retinue of more than 100 supporters, had arrived in Southampton, England in 1856. Here is some of the party, not including the mother of the king, because of course she was in Purdah as a Muslim lady and couldn't appear and certainly couldn't have her photograph taken. The king had been left behind in Calcutta, and this royal party came to London with an English agent to try and reverse the annexation of Awadi that had taken place in the previous year brought about by the Governor-General of India, Lord Dalhousie. The Queen Mother, as she was called in England, remained in Purdah throughout the time in the UK, but the male members of the party, and you can see them here, were taken all around the UK, to Manchester, where this photograph was taken, to Glasgow, to Liverpool, and also to meet the East India Company directors in London. And the royal party met with Queen Victoria. An audience at Buckingham Palace took place at the beginning of July 1857. This is the only time when Queen Victoria met face to face with a Muslim woman from India. It was carefully arranged using the cupboard, the closet in the white drawing room of the Buckingham Palace. The Malaika, the Queen Mother, was secluded, was hidden from the vision of Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, and the other men in the royal party. The Queen Mother presented an address from her son in which she described the friendly relations between his court and previous kings, George IV and William IV. And the address also refuted all the allegations made against him by the British, and appealed to Queen Victoria as she was responsible, the letter said, for, quote, distributing justice to all the inhabitants of the British territories. It didn't work. It was to no avail. It was a failure. By the time the Awadis got to the Queen in London, the mutinies were already happening back in India, across northern India, from Bengal through the northwest provinces into the Punjab and down into parts of central India as well. An emperor, the king of Delhi, was back on the throne in Delhi. The ex-king of Awad was locked up in Fort William in Calcutta, and the British residency at Lucknow lay under siege, and the king's estranged wife, the Begum Hazrat Mahal, had taken control of the court. The Malaika, the mother-in-law, died in Paris trying to return to India, and the rest of this party remained stranded for many months in Britain. Now, this meeting between Queen Victoria and the Awadi court at the beginning of the Indian Rebellion tells us a great deal about the role of Queen Victoria in the revolt, and also about the place of India in Queen Victoria's own statecraft, her own politics. The Queen was seen as a final court of appeal by many of the Indian princes. At the same time, the episode emphasises how Victoria was a Christian queen within a European culture infused with a heightened sense of religious difference and superiority. By the mid-1850s, Victoria personified much of the Protestant ideology of British India. For example, there were Christian converts, Indian princes, who had come to live in the court of Queen Victoria, notably Duleep Singh, the exiled prince of the Punjab. By 1857, this Protestantism was intensified. Britain had intervened in the Crimea with France to defend Christian minorities, and then had begun a war with the Shia Shah of Persia in 1856. Britain was willing to fight in the name of religion. And as the revolt in India, as we will see, in 1857-8, came to turn on a clash of religious cultures, so Queen Victoria became identified with Protestant zeal. In this way, Victoria, far removed from the battle, symbolised many of the tensions over which the rebels were battling, as I will try and show you in the first part of my paper. In the second half of my talk, I want to turn to show how the revolt in India proved a turning point for Victoria herself. During 1857 and 1858, she argued for her cabinet to have a better military response to the rebellion. She had her own channels of information about the events in India, from returning soldiers, from widows, from specially commissioned artists and photographers, and from her own private correspondence. And once the rebellion was finished, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert turned their attention to the post-war settlement, the transfer of the government of India from the company, the East India Commercial Company, to the Crown, to the British government. And I will show you just how interventionist Victoria and Albert were in this new constitution for India, and particularly in the proclamation which made the declaration of the transfer of power and which was promulgated in India on the 1st of November 1858 and which became known in India as the Magna Carta of Indian liberties. I will show you that it is very much Queen Victoria's authorship. So let me start with the rebellion. The Indian Rebellion, 1857-8, had many causes, many effects, and I won't try and cover all of the historiography. Social change, modernised communications, religion, new taxes, old grievances, all combined to turn a regular occurrence in India, army mutinies, they happen very often, into widespread organised disaffection. One by one, across the garrison towns of northern India, from Bengal over here, up the Ganges, down into Bihar, up into the northwest provinces and around Delhi, the revolt spread like wildfire, always beginning with mutinies in the Indian regiments of the army. The particular cause was the Muslim troops who objected, who opposed the practice of greasing rifle cartridges using animal fat. This was an insult to their religion. The former king of Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was returned to the city and proclaimed emperor at the end of May. And there were other rebel governments established in the north of India. Queen Victoria was singled out by many of these rebels for particular attack. On the 6th of June 1857, the rebel leader Nana Saheb was proclaimed Peshwa at Kanpur. In announcing his assumption of power, he accused Queen Victoria herself of being behind a plan to Christianize forcibly the sepoys, the Indian soldiers in the army. And there were similar rumours also expressed at Lucknow. And in early July, 2 months later, a pamphlet calling for a jihad against Britain, a holy war, entitled Fatah-e-Islam, argued that servitude under a Muslim king would be better for Indian princes than, quote, under the infidel Victoria and the English. So very early on in the revolt, Queen Victoria is associated with the perceived evils of the British in India. The rebellion saw unprecedented levels of violence on both sides. And in return, Britain poured in European and colonial troops from the west and from the east and drew on every ounce, every gram of loyalty to be found in India itself. Gurkha troops were provided from Nepal in the north. From the southwest, the armies of the princes in Scindia, in Gwalior, in Indore, cordoned off routes down to Gujarat and the western coast. To the northwest, absolutely key, the armies of the Punjab held back from taking up arms against the British, despite there being mutinies there, and were able to really end the occupation of Delhi. Delhi was recovered by the British by September 1857. The sons of the king were captured in this famous scene in the tomb of Humayun, and the two sons were executed in front of the aged king, who was then put on trial. Still, the revolt continued as the Rani of Jhansi, one of the female rebels, the most potent woman icon of the rebellion, held out and joined other leaders such as Nana Sahib, converging on Gwalior, where they were eventually defeated over a year later in June. By the end of 1858, Awad was under British control, and remaining pockets of resistance in Bengal and Bihar were suppressed as well. Many things are going on in the Indian rebellion, and we now have at least 60 years of scholarship which has looked at this topic. I would argue, though, that at the heart of the revolt lies two things: religion and political power. And in both those aspects, Queen Victoria became a focal point for some of the rebels and some of their arguments. The spark which ignited the immediate cause of the mutiny, the greasing with animal fat of soldiers' cartridges, signified a colonial arrogance towards Hinduism and towards Islam, raising the fear, the conspiracy that sepoys would be subjected to Christian conversion. And the restoration of the Mughal emperor in Delhi gave legitimacy to traditional forms of dynastic rule in India, which decades of rule by the British had tried to undermine or at least to reduce in power. Much of the blame for the religious and political potency at the heart of the mutiny can be laid at the door of the Marquis of Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India from 1848 to 1856, a Scottish statesman in India, like many other Governor-Generals of India previously and to come, an evangelical Protestant. Under his rule, evangelical Protestantism had grown in India. Restrictions on the remarriage of Hindu widows had been lifted. Greater protection had been given to the property of native Christian converts, and more encouragement given to missionary work in schools and in villages in Bengal and the northwest provinces. For example, in April 1857, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts revised its plans for the expansion of the Anglican Church in India, and it called for 3 new Protestant bishops, one in Agra, where the Taj Mahal is, one in Lahore in the Punjab, and another one in the south, in Madras. So 2 of those new bishoprics were going to be right in the heart of where the rebellion against Protestant Britain took place. Dalhousie was not only an evangelical Protestant Governor-General, he also pushed through the most extensive annexation of territory to Britain in the Indian subcontinent since the end of the Maratha Wars in 1804. The subjugation of the Punjab in 1849 was followed by imposition of direct rule in many other parts of India. For example, in parts of the Rajput states, down in Beras, in part of Hyderabad, up in the northeast, I will break my neck if I turn, Sikkim, and then of course this is the beginning of the British move into Burma. This is all under Dalhousie in the space of a very short in a very short time. And the justification that Dalhousie used was the doctrine of lapse. In other words, an Indian ruler would die and there was no natural successor. And you know how important it is for the British for there always to be normal lines of dynasty. Dalhousie could not find this in India, where there was no natural heir. Then the British were taking over. Annexation did not go unopposed. Most rulers could point to existing treaty arrangements with the East India Company, and they devoted considerable time and resource to contesting, to challenging the policy of Dalhousie. Perhaps the most famous campaign was by the Raja of Satara. Satara is down here, around the coast of the Arabian Sea. There it is, just in the very north of the Bombay Presidency. And that was a campaign, someone should write a dissertation on it, it's a really important topic, which had a lot of support in Britain. But there were many other appeals from princes and rulers in India who were suffering from annexation. These included the Rani of Jhansi, who we will see in the rebellion, widowed in 1853, and who in 1854 instructed legal counsel in London to appeal directly to Queen Victoria. Nana Sahib, another rebel in 1857, who was the exiled son of a Marathi princely family from the Bombay area, who also sent his emissary, his representative, to London on a similar mission, although he spent most of his time going to the horse races. And then, as we've seen, the Awadi delegation of 1856, who was the only one to get all the way to Queen Victoria. One deposed ruler, the King of Delhi, enjoyed no such access. None of his representatives ever got to Calcutta or even to London to make his case. From his assumption of his title in the 1830s through to the rebellion in 1857, the King of Delhi's status and privileges were restricted by British administrations. He wasn't allowed to take part in the very common practice of exchanging presents and gifts with the British monarchs. He wasn't allowed to confer titles on other Indian rulers. He wasn't allowed to receive presentations at Muslim festivals. After 1848, under Dalhousie, it became even worse. He wasn't allowed to cultivate his own melons, which goes back to a Persian tradition of abundance associated with agriculture and orchards. He wasn't allowed to sacrifice buffaloes, and he wasn't allowed to issue coins bearing his insignia. So the King of Delhi, associated as the foremost representative of Islamic rule, was particularly targeted by the British and by Dalhousie. So Dalhousie and his policy of annexation isn't just Britain slowly acquiring more empire in a fit of absence of mind, in the famous phrase. In absorbing territory, Dalhousie was deliberately displacing ancient Muslim and Hindu kingdoms and princely states and their religious and ceremonial infrastructure. I don't have time to talk about it now, but in his Durbar tours in the early 1850s, he appropriated the old forms of Mughal rule in order to enforce allegiance to Christian Britain and its queen. His administration encouraged depictions of Awad rule as decadent, as corrupt, and as immoral, and ended official and unofficial communications between Lucknow and Calcutta and Lucknow and London. The Dalhousie years in India, in other words, fueled religious divisions and exacerbated dynastic dissent, in many ways creating the political materials out of which the revolt emerged. And he was doing all of this in the name of the Queen whose court he had worked in before he went to India. It was Dalhousie who was part of the palace, the Windsor Castle court in the 1840s. It was Dalhousie who choreographed, who organised the Queen's first ever foreign tour to Scotland in 1842. This was a man who very much knew what he was doing in the name of his Christian Queen. Now, back in London, Queen Victoria was no doubt ignorant of how the leaders of the Indian revolt were calling her very nasty names. But she quickly discerned, she quickly identified the cause of the mutinies. Writing to Charlotte Canning, the Governor-General's wife, the day after she saw the Awadi delegation, so she's just heard the news, it's come through on the Telegraph. No, it hasn't come through on the Telegraph, sorry, it's come through the correspondence. She says, a fear of their religion being tampered with is at the bottom of the mutiny. So straight away she knew the cause. And over that summer she repeatedly called on Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, to increase the supply of extra troops, not just from Asia, but from other parts of the British Empire, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada. A regiment was ready to go from Canada all the way across the world. By the time it got there, the rebellion was over. Her reactions were those of a warrior queen. Okay, although she was depicted as a Beatrix, as a peaceful, a dispenser and conveyor of peace, she very much looked to a quick military suppression of the rebellion. And in that way, Queen Victoria, as a female monarch, stood apart, was very different from the very gendered response in Britain to the Indian rebellion. If you look at a lot of the contemporary newspapers and magazines and books and descriptive accounts of the mutiny published in Britain in 1857, 58, 59, the violence and bloodshed of the mutiny is described as rape, the rape of India, the rape of white European culture, and there were so many shock stories about the ferocity with which the rebels attacked European women and children, most famously the well at Kanpur and the siege at Lucknow. Now, Victoria was certainly aware, we know from her diary, from her journal, of these atrocities, and she shared in the wave of emotional indignation that broke over Britain from late August. To quote one entry in her journal, "If only they had been shot down," she said, writing about the European women and children at Kanpur. "If only they had been shot down, it would not be so ghastly, so terrible, but everything that can outrage feelings, every torture that can be conceived, has been perpetrated." So she certainly knew of all the stories of rape and mutilation. However, the sensational reporting did not hold her attention. She began to change her mind as she heard other sources of what was going on. And by November, 4 months after the news of the mutiny, Victoria was saying to Canning, the new Governor-General, that she thought, quote, "the unchristian spirit shown by the British public would not last," and she was actually asking for specific evidence of ill treatment of European women. Now, to get this evidence, Queen Victoria turned to the Governor-General's wife, Charlotte Canning, who had been one of her ladies-in-waiting, part of her court circle in the 1840s. There's a very interesting connection between the people who rule India and the British court, and very, very much the same personnel. From Charlotte Canning, Victoria received the most detailed accounts of the rebellion all the way through the late 1850s. And Charlotte Canning's letters, and she kept a diary as well, supplied Victoria with a different account of what was happening in Kanpur and Lucknow. Charlotte Canning was very careful to discriminate between the evidence of the killing of Europeans and the rape and mutilation of the children and the women before they died. And she explained to Victoria that most of the stories the true stories were of mutilations to dead bodies rather than the rape and killing of people while they were obviously still alive. There was no credible evidence, Victoria was told, of violent sexual assault whilst the women and children were alive. Charlotte Canning also encouraged Queen Victoria to seek out visual representations of India. The royal family in Britain was obsessed with technology, with telegraph, and with photography. And of course the 1850s is really the beginning of serious outdoor landscape and portrait photography across Western Europe and the United States of America. As soon as Charlotte Canning had got to India, she was arranging for photographs of prisoners in the Calcutta jails to be sent to Queen Victoria because they were ethnographically interesting. But in 1858, she passed on the news of the work of two photographers, Dr. John Murray and the Swiss-Italian Felice Beato, who were in India documenting the suppression of the rebellion. Here's a shot by Murray. And so Victoria sees these views during the course of 1858, whilst the mutiny is still being suppressed. Victoria also commissions her own painter, the Swedish court painter Lundgren, who had been busy painting pictures of royal weddings and public openings of monuments, and then in January 1858 he is sent to India to catch the end of the suppression of the rebellion. This is a picture of the end of the siege of Lucknow, which was a sketch later used by other painters. And Charlotte herself was a watercolourist as well as a photographer, and during 1858 and 59 she sends her own images. Many of these are picturesque scenes, ancient buildings, landscape views. This is Amritsar, the famous temple and tank. But she also sent watercolours of battlefields, depictions of Farrukhabad, Kanpur and Lucknow. So Victoria is not just familiar with stories, textual descriptions and published accounts and correspondence. She is also more familiar than many others, with the topography of the Indian rebellion. Many of these pictures are not collected and published in Britain until the end of the decade and into the early 1860s. The only landscapes, as far as I can tell, that she did not view were those of Robert and Harriet Tytler, who were actually taking photographs during the siege of Delhi. And of course it was they, the Tytlers, who took the very famous picture of the Emperor of Delhi, not this warrior king, but this aging man, this poet and lover of the arts, and as the British claimed, drug addict as well. I don't think she saw that picture any time before anybody else saw it. Now, we can only speculate the effect of these images on Queen Victoria's understanding. She's not collecting these pictures as trophies. We know that Beato's pictures were collected by Europeans in Calcutta as sort of reminders of European victory. And it's too early for the kind of mutiny tourism that begins to emerge in the 1860s, or by the 1860s you've got people going around the mutiny sites collecting images and memorabilia. I would argue that Victoria looks at these pictures of India under battle much like in the manner of her favourite photographer, Roger Fenton, best known for his work on the Crimean War, but also for his work on famous British buildings, and also for his portraits of characters in Oriental costume. It's a bit of a digression, but Fenton's portfolio, I think, is her preferred kind of photography. And she probably compares these sorts of pictures with his. An Eastern sublime, ravaged by war, beautifully ornate mosques and palaces, stockpiled with armoury, disempowered colonial buildings, pockmarked with cannon fire and bullet holes, soldiers resting battle-weary in arid settings. These are dissonant images. They're not glorifying war, nor are they sentimentalizing the aftermath of revolt. They're displaying the chaos of war. And war is the word that Queen Victoria uses. Not revolt, not rebellion, not mutiny. She says this is civil war. And as far as I can tell, in 1857-58, there are only two other people calling the Indian revolt a civil war. One is Benjamin Disraeli, and the other is Karl Marx. She's in good company then. So, as the Indian revolt is being suppressed, we go back to Britain, because the British government transfer power, as I've said already, from the East India Company, a commercial, economic, profit-making organisation, to the government, or actually to the Crown. And the interesting story in 1858 is that Queen Victoria thinks the Crown means her. Yeah? So when the Government of India Bill is being debated through 1858, she is sent drafts and copies, and on one of them she gets out her blue pencil and writes, "Is this absolute power?" Okay? I'm not going to talk about the bill as much as talk about the proclamation, but the bill that transfers, the law that transfers power to the Crown is very important, because it does give strength to her prerogative. What does it do? Well, it allows her to see all correspondence relating to India. It allows her to have a say in the appointment of Indian officials, and particularly military patronage. Okay? This is at a time, remember, when the constitutional writer Walter Bagehot, in the English Constitution, 1867, is saying the Queen, the Crown, only has symbolic or theatrical power. Real power, efficient power, lies with the House of Commons, but effectively with the Cabinet, Bagehot argues. So this is an important moment, and I think an important counter-example, which shows that Bagehot is actually wrong. Actually, Bagehot, that's a long story, but Bagehot gets his job because of the Queen's patronage over Indian government, and I can tell you the story of that in questions, but it's a digression here. Anyway, I won't talk about the bill. I want to talk about the proclamation. The bill takes, the act of transfer takes 8 or 9 months, and it's done by the August of 1858, and by then the Queen is going off to Prussia, to Potsdam, where her daughter, 17-year-old Princess Victoria, is expecting her first child. And you know who that is. Kaiser Wilhelm, who of course leads the German Reich into the First World War. All these empires and babies and dynasties, it's all happening at the same time. Now from Potsdam, she redrafts and changes the proclamation, the announcement of the transfer of power. Now, we've always known about the Queen's direct involvement with the proclamation. It was known in her lifetime. All the detail about how she wrote the sentences is in Theodore Martin's Life of the Prince Consort, his 5-volume biography of Prince Albert, which was published in the 1870s, translated into Bengali in 1892, and all of the correspondence is there, which shows what they were doing in Potsdam when they were meant to be looking after their pregnant daughter. They were actually deciding on the government of India. Now, the proclamation states what has been agreed in Parliament, that the Crown is to take the authority from the Company, the Governor-General is to become a Viceroy, all existing treaties with native rulers will be honoured, no more annexation, although there is some later. Employment in public service was to be open to Europeans and to Indians, and equal and impartial protection would be given to all subjects in the exercise of religion. So religious tolerance, all of that is there. And there would be an amnesty for everyone except those who were found guilty of murder. Now, this principle of religious neutrality is very important, because the British government still wanted to use in the proclamation the Queen's official title, Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, the title that all British monarchs had had since 1534. Earlier. Yes, it is earlier. Act of Supremacy is 34. So since the 1520s. Thank you. Yeah. So, and of course the Defender of the Faith is Defender of the Christian faith. But they wanted to keep that title. At the same time, the legislation was saying we will not change any native religions or customs, and we will not propagate any Christian religious beliefs. So the government of Britain, now led by Lord Derby, the one who likes horse racing, there's a lot of horse racing stories here, and in fact during the debates in Parliament in those days used to have a day off for the day of the Epsom Derby, so all the politicians could go and watch the races. And this happens in the middle of this crisis earlier in the year. Anyway, there's the dilemma here. How do you maintain identity as a Christian political culture, but also offer meaningful words of pacification in India? And the proclamation also had to give voice to the Queen. The government were determined to embody the government of India in the name of the Queen. They had a kind of Orientalist approach to India, believing that the symbolic person of the Queen was more important than a written constitution. So one of the government ministers says to Lord Derby, this is going to be one of the most important state papers ever issued by the Minister of the Crown. The tone needed to be high. References to the British government should be replaced with the Queen. Actually, Lord Derby then forgot to take his copy with him because he left London to go and stay with some colleagues. But the Foreign Secretary, who's now joined Albert and Victoria in Potsdam, does have the right draft with him. And she shows Victoria the draft proclamation that the politicians have come up with. And she is not pleased. She is not amused. The foreign minister is told by the Queen that he must entirely rewrite the proclamation. In particular, she wanted to be referred to as the royal we throughout. She wanted more in the proclamation about Britain making promises to the future prosperity and welfare of the Indian people and to the relief of poverty. And she wanted to say something about how Indians would enjoy the same privileges as all subjects of the British Crown. She also wanted to refer to the commencement of the new reign. Okay? So this was like a new era, and she wanted that emphasised. She turned to Prince Albert. She always turns to Prince Albert when she wants a really important letter written. And this is what he writes to the Prime Minister. He said, "The Queen would be very glad," terribly polite, "if Lord Derby would write it himself in his excellent language, bearing in mind that it is a female sovereign who speaks to more than 100 millions of Eastern people on assuming the direct government over them after a bloody civil war, giving them pledges which her future reign is to redeem, and explaining the principles of her government. Such a document should breathe feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious feeling, pointing out the privileges which the Indians will receive in being placed on an equality with the subjects of the British Crown and the prosperity which will follow in the train of civilization." So it looks like it's all there. It's religious toleration, it's economic investment, it's equality in terms of political rights, and it's a post-war settlement. Now, the proclamation eventually appears first published in India. Okay, there's no publication of it in Britain before it appears in India the beginning of November. It is kept quiet for about 6 weeks. No one wants to talk about it or touch it, because it is actually a very anti-Protestant document, or so it seems to a lot of evangelical Protestants. There are plenty of people in India who can see it as a very evangelical document still. However, the actual proclamation didn't do everything that Queen Victoria asked. If you look at the proclamation, there is no reference in it to Indians enjoying the same equality as other subjects of the British Crown. The nearest the proclamation comes is in the 7th paragraph, where the Queen declares to, quote, hold ourselves bound to the natives of our Indian territories by the same obligations of duty which bind us to all our other subjects. That's not the same as saying having equal rights. The monarch has obligations, doesn't say that the subjects have equal rights. Nor is there any reference to the commencement of a new reign. That is completely ignored. And yet, the proclamation assumes iconic status. I'm not talking about it in this paper today, but in the book, when it's published, there's a whole section on the proclamation in India, where it is widely publicised and translated into the 20 or so principal vernaculars of the Indian subcontinent. So why does it get this reputation for being this very liberal, tolerant document? It's partly because that letter that I quoted is what then circulates in India. The letter where she sets out what she wants the proclamation to do. That is included in all of the many vernacular biographies of Queen Victoria, which begin to be published from the 1870s and 1880s. And by the time of the Jubilees, the 50 and 60 year celebrations in 1887 and 1897, that quote, that letter I gave you, is being reproduced everywhere. And that, in a way, becomes the proclamation. I want to finish with one more episode of the aftermath of the revolt, and then I'll make some points in conclusion. Is that all right? Yes. Okay. Now, one final instalment remained in the transfer of power. Lord Palmerston, the Liberal Prime Minister, there's a lot of changes of government in this period, suggested to the Queen that an Indian order of knighthood, an order of chivalry, a kind of system of honour, be established as a means of rewarding and strengthening the personal bonds of loyalty between Queen Victoria and the Indian princes who had remained loyal in 1857. And this was the Star of India, a new order of chivalry, and it was very much the baby of Prince Albert, who through 1859 and 1860 gets very excited about the project. He designs the title, he designs all of the mottos and the insignia and the ribbons which go with the new order. Now, from a distance, the Star of India looks like an attempt to impose Western ideas of status and hierarchy on princely India, cloaked in that kind of medieval mystique, the Gothic bequest in which the Victorians specialised. It's in that sense it's modelled on other colonial orders of chivalry, like the Order of St. Patrick, the one for Ireland. And over time, and there are other versions of the Star of India, down to the 1930s, membership of the order reads like a who's who of British Indian society. Indians and Europeans are included. However, in the aftermath of the rebellion, the Star of India is a roll call of loyalty. Okay? Particular emphasis is given to those chiefs who had supported the British, those Indian princes and chiefs who had supported the British in 1857-8, either by supplying troops or making sure that their troops stayed at home, didn't go out and fight. And the Governor-General Canning was particularly concerned that the awards be made for recognition of service rather than because of what he called ancient dignity. So if you look at the 8 princes who get the Star of India in eventually in 1861. 5 Hindu princes: Scindia, the Maharaja of Kashmir, Holkar of Indore, Maharaja of Patiala, and the Gaekwar of Baroda, and 3 Muslim rulers: the Nizam of Hyderabad, the female Begum of Bhopal, and the Nawab of Rampur. They are all key supporters of the British during the mutiny and its suppression. Nobody from the south, nobody from the west, although there are some very powerful Indian dynasties down there, such as the Maharaja of Mysore or the Rajas of Cochin and Travancore. That in geographic terms, you can plot it on the map, this Star of India reflected the band of loyalism that had ringed the rebel strongholds from the north and the south. And the order is established to mark the beginning of the Queen's new reign. The first investiture takes place in Windsor Castle on the 1st of November 1861, so exactly 3 years after the proclamation. And it's one of the final occasions when Prince Albert appears in public, because, of course, 6 weeks later he's dead, and Queen Victoria wears mourning black dress for the rest of her life. There is also a simultaneous ceremony in Calcutta in 1861. And again, I think it is a reminder, not really of Britain imposing a new kind of knightly chivalric culture on a supine and deferent set of Indian princes, but actually rewarding loyalty and good service during what has been a very bloody war. Let me make some points in conclusion, then I hope there'll be and we'll welcome time for questions. So, in Britain, the proclamation of India is quite a quiet affair because the evangelical opinion is so strong, there is not much publicity given to it. In India, it is a huge occasion, and the governments of all the presidencies and all of the independent states go to great lengths to publicise it and publish it. In the proclamation, the government of India and the British government at home chose to fully associate Queen Victoria with the new form of rule. She is personified as the ruler. And in later years, you can see this in very material terms. The new Indian rupee, after 1861, has the head of Queen Victoria and stylized in what looks like Indian dress. By the mid-1870s, or by the early 1870s, the opening of the Suez Canal and rapid steamship travel means that Queen Victoria's children can travel to India. Duke of Edinburgh, 1869-70, Prince of Wales, 1875. So very much going out there as the representatives of the Queen. But alongside this choice by the government of India to use the Queen as a vehicle of sovereignty and authority, the Queen also becomes a new form of appeal, a new focus of petition, and the increase in direct communication between not only Indian princes but in many cases ordinary Indian people and Queen Victoria through the 1860s and the 1870s is very striking. And this, in other words, be careful what you do with this very potent symbol. And perhaps the best example of that, it's often forgotten that the Indian National Congress emerges in the mid-1880s around the time of the first Jubilee, the 50 years of Queen Victoria on the throne, and their very first documents are very loyal towards Queen Victoria, associating her particularly with the authorship of the proclamation. I hope I've also shown that 1857-8 marks a turning point in Queen Victoria's own attitude towards India. I mean, you'll have to read the whole book when it appears in 18 months' time or so. But I think she moves during that period, during those years, from being a very evangelical queen towards India, supporting the growth of the Anglican Church, intervening on issues around Hindu marriage. And Prince Albert is certainly very evangelical in many respects. But I think she becomes this patriot queen, more likely to take the side of what she perceives to be the Indian people than the government of India. There's a very nice quote which sums that up around this time, and if you bear with me, I will find it eventually in your questions, I hope. But she does talk about the paramount obligation of the governors becoming to rule in the interests of the governed. It's a phrase something like that. Now, part of this is because of the coincidence of Albert's death. Albert takes a great interest in India, in its arts, in its language. He's particularly interested in Sanskrit. Think of all of those German exile professors like Max Müller who become experts on the languages of the East. He gives them a lot of patronage. And he's also very interested as a German prince in army reform as well. So when he dies, and much of this post-war reconstruction of the government of India is taking place and involving Victoria and Albert, she calls India his sacred legacy. That's the actual phrase she uses. And I think becomes very focused on it and encourages her sons, particularly the Prince of Wales, to become interested. Actually, he goes, but he's not that interested. The son who's really interested is the Duke of Connaught, Arthur, who actually settles in India in the 1880s. He and his wife learn Hindi, and they become very absorbed in the Anglo-Indian community there. But I think ultimately the reason why there is such a transformation in Queen Victoria's attitudes towards India after the Indian Rebellion is because she grasps what transfer of power to the crown really means, and for her it means personal rule. I'll finish there. You've been a very good audience. Thank you all very much.